I've had a silly idea for a little while now, and it's all thanks to this person who has been making digital models in 1:50 scale. Windham Graves' work is really quite good and you should check them out. But the model specifically that I'm looking at today is this, the LeHaitre Tractorcycle. And after a brief bit of research, it turns out that this strange vehicle was real. Seemingly the musings of a 1930s inventor, this single-tracked vehicle in the form of a motorbike was made, although never put into serious production, with probably only one or two ever being built. It is quite cool, and Windham's version looks fantastic, and so I had to use it somewhere at some point. And whilst I was recently building up the US Armoured Infantry, I realised that a mounted squad of US troops on these mono tracks would be pretty fun and would fit into Conflict 47 quite well. I mentioned a while back that I got the Desktop Heroes Army shirt component, which I've been 3D printing to use all of the extra plastic arms and heads for all the kits that I have. In fact, I did a video on that subject, but I still have access to that part, and so I set about using their posing tool to get the legs in a riding a bike type of pose. I kinda wish I'd gone for a different approach, or at least put some more effort into this, as the legs didn't really end up where they should have been in the final models, but it's close enough for gaming, it's fine, don't look too closely. Once I had all the pieces, I put them all into my slicer, and a sneaky trick you can do here is superimpose models and then save them as a unified STL. And so I put my torso and legs onto Windham's model of the Tractorcycle. As they are going to be Americans, I also found a big star that I stretched out through the entire thing to poke out of the same place on both sides. I made a few slight variations, including one with a foot on the floor, and mirrored them as well to add variation. And what's this? A new printer? Ooh, that's nice. I won't have to excuse the poor print quality anymore because this one's actually pretty good. But you will notice that I printed these without arms and heads because I still was going to use the plastic parts to finish them off. And I went hunting through my American sprues for appropriate arms. Well, it turns out I hadn't positioned the bodies, and particularly the shoulders, very well, because not only do the feet not rest on the footrests, these shoulders are far too far from the handlebars for the length of the arm. I'll fix that in a moment, but I also need to adjust the position of the hand first on the plastic parts so that they can feasibly be in that handle holding position. It's really not that hard, all I have to do is slice it off and glue it back on rotated to point downwards. To reposition the shoulder, I essentially cut the model at the waist so that I could have them leaning forwards. Cutting through printed resin is notoriously hard because it can shatter, and it's a matter of luck if that shatter line cracks where you want it to, or off into some detail that you would rather have preserved. I did this with 3 of the models. I shaved the kind of cracked parts and glued them back into a position where the hand would fit on the handlebar. For another one I found a really long stretched arm, and for 2 more they have the foot on the floor, so I don't actually need their hands on the handlebars. I really didn't want to fit any 2 arms on any single model, and I probably could manage that, but it just seemed like a lot of work. Instead, I found all of the arms that are holding M1 carbines or Thompsons in a single arm. Slung at the shoulder, held loose, pointed up, anything's gonna do, so long as it's one arm holding the gun. And naturally, when I went for heads, I went for the US helmet for most of them, although the squad leader has a cap and a spare helmet stowed on the front of the vehicle. Now, I've ended up putting quite a lot of work into these for a simple 3D print, but there's one last step before I get to painting. My whole US platoon is on milliput cobblestones, and so for these that's really easy. I got some 25 by 50 pill bases, smushed down some milliputs, smoothed it out with water, and rolled on the texture. Easy. Smoothing with water keeps the roller from sticking, but it also levels it out, which helps kind of generating that texture, as the low spots won't be touched by the roller, so you do want it fairly flat. Now, I forgot to record this and several other bits in this video, but I gave the models a dark green base coat with a light green zenithal. I've used this technique or similar on a lot of models recently, so you probably aren't surprised by that. But what might surprise you is I took some of my homemade wash and mixed some paint into it. In this case, it's all various shades of browns. And this is something that I can do with my homemade washes. I can adjust it however I like. And if I adjust it in this way, I make sort of a kind of pseudo heavy wash-ish. It's certainly not comparable to an off-the-shelf like speed paint or contrast paint or whatever, and it's maybe not even quite as good as just a standard homemade ink heavy wash. It's thick and messy, and it lets me just keep a little bit of that zenithal impression for the shirts, because the green is still showing through. And so it is that slight bit of benefit over a solid base coat. After that, there's a whole bunch of boring other base coats. Tan for the slings and belts and pouches. I picked out the gun barrels and a few of the gubbins on the Tractorcycle with a dark metallic. There's a fuel cool vents on the side, as well as a long exhaust running from the engine up front to the back underneath the rider's feet. The Allied star, of course, got white, but white doesn't cover well over nearly anything, and so I gave a single coat of grey first. Now the grey does coat quite nicely, and then the white covers nicely over the grey, a little trick that I have learned. And why not some dark brown for the bags and the gun stocks? Traditional and boring. Also boring is black for the boots, buff those nice and shiny. But for anyone who's seen my armoured Conflict 47 officers videos, any of them, you may be asking, where's my black lining? And yes, that's coming. Usually I do that first. I like to get the black lining in really early so I can be strong and messy with it, because the other steps of painting as I go end up cleaning it up, and it gives a really nice bold effect. And there's a good reason why I didn't do that first on these specific models. I forgot. That's the reason. Thankfully I did remember to do that before I put on the ink wash, and when it comes to ink washes, my standard ones, the black wash going over the track cycles is going to match my vehicles, my tanks, and my Conflict 47 armoured suits that I already painted recently. But for the riders, I'm using a brown wash. I'm actually using a pre-made brown wash, not my own custom ones, simply because I have it and I may as well use it up. And that will make them match my infantry for my bolt action models that I've already painted. The one real difference between how I've painted these track cycles and how I've painted other vehicles in the past is the lack of modulation. In this case, because these track cycles are so small, I've just gone with a green base coat and a zenithal highlight of light green. Just a simple straight down zenithal. And it does give some definition to the shapes and any surface pointing upwards, but not picking out every panel as I usually do on tanks. Thankfully, my usual edge highlight, which I did include on the track cycle, does give me quite that little bit of definition on the panels, and importantly it also lets me hide the messiness from the panel lining that went on earlier. Which is of course why I do the panel lining early. After that, the riders are just getting honestly some really basic work. Almost not enough to be worth showing on video, but it is the result of my experiments with painting my American infantry so far. I have found that many details can be left with just the base coat and the wash if they're not the interesting parts of the model. But you do need at least some interesting stuff up at the top of the model to be cleaned up to focus the attention of the viewer. In the case of my Americans, the most of that is going to be the brown shirt and the skin that gets most of the work. And even the shirt isn't getting too much attention because it already has my custom heavy wash and then a conventional wash over the top. There's quite a lot of subtle variation in tone here, so all I need to do really is clean those up and get a nice, sharp, brightest level highlight to it. And then I can move on to the skin and I can put on a few odd details here and there around the models, and they can probably end up looking quite striking with not a lot of work. The darker, sharp form of the monotrack below, with the lighter, brighter riders and their soft shapes up at the top. I have been adding a reddy purple to my skin tones recently. As human skin is transparent, there should be a subtle tone of the blood underneath. Although it could be argued that I've been using it a little too strongly before, this time I'm trying to be much more subtle. I'm mixing it with a light brown to really dull it down to make my shadow colour, and then highlighting that up into a Caucasian mixed with the same brown, and then the Caucasian paint over the top. It gives nearly a passable skin effect, and obviously I still need practice. At some point I need to do just a bunch of skin on some models to deliberately practice not just Caucasian skin tones but multiple skin tones and how that actually works. So with the last few details being painted on the models, I can kind of look at how I might actually use them. Officially, the American forces don't have any option for a motorcycle of any type in Conflict 47, or at least as far as I've been able to find. And so this unit will remain as a house rule, kind of ask your friend's permission kind of unit. But they are pretty cool, and so any friend of mine should probably say yes. Bikes in Bolt Action and Conflict 47 pretty much act as infantry but with superior movement, usually costing 5 points per model extra, and I'll keep that points cost for the LeHaitre Tractorcycle just to keep things simple. Wheeled bikes get a movement of 12 and 24, which is the same as wheeled vehicles. But I think the tracked vehicle movement of 918 suits these tracked bikes a little better. And that is a negative compared to wheeled bikes. On the other hand, as a plus, tracked vehicles can traverse rough ground. I think otherwise, I'm pretty much going to leave the rules for wheeled bikes and infantry units as they are for the track bikes, with those two small changes. And that's just because I don't want to make it too complex. Well, this unit is complete. A simple paint job for sure, but they are wargaming models. I hope I'll get to use them on the tabletop at some point in the future. Let me know what your thoughts of the models that I've come up with based on this strange vehicle made in the 20s. I'm certainly a fan, and what do you think of my little house rule for them? Well, for the moment, the models are finished, and so I can say I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.